Claire Whitmore pressed her fingers against the wagon wheel's iron rim as it rolled away from her, her father's eyes never once looking back. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just stood there in the Rocky Mountain Pass, with her bad leg trembling beneath her, and watched her entire family choose to leave her behind. If you've ever been abandoned by the people who were supposed to love you most, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel. Follow Claire's story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon had been gone for 11 minutes before Claire's legs finally gave out. She knew the exact count because she'd been watching the dust trail thin out against the summer sky, counting her own heartbeats the way her mother had taught her to count stitches steadily, without rushing, so you didn't lose your place. But there was no stitch to come back to now, no seam to pull tight. The dust just kept spreading itself thinner and thinner across the blue Colorado sky until it was nothing at all, and Claire's right leg buckled sideways, and she went down hard on one knee in the mountain dirt. The pain shot straight up through her hip and into her spine. She sucked air through her teeth and held herself there on that one knee like she was praying, both palms flat on the ground, fingers pressing into the dry summer earth. She was not praying. She was trying not to fall all the way over. "Get up," she said out loud. Her own voice surprised her, thin and tight the way a wire sounds right before it snaps. "Get up right now, Claire." She pushed herself back to standing. Her right hip screamed at her. It had been screaming at her for the better part of 3 weeks, ever since the wagon wheel had lurched over a granite shelf outside of Denver and thrown her sideways against the sideboards. She'd hit the wood with the full weight of her body, and something deep in her right hip had shifted in a way that hadn't shifted back. Her father had looked at it that evening, pressed his thumb along the joint, and said it was a bruise. Said she was making it worse than it was. Said a lot of things that turned out not to be true. She stood in the pass and looked east in the direction the wagon had gone. Then she looked west at the trail they'd come up from. Then she looked north where the mountain peaks rose clean and brutal against the summer light, their upper ridges still white even in July. There was not a soul in any direction. "Okay," she said. She didn't know who she was saying it to. Maybe to the mountain. Maybe to herself. Maybe to some version of God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. She said it again anyway. "Okay." Then she started walking. Ned. Her name was Claire Whitmore, and she was 22 years old, and 3 weeks ago she had believed that she was on her way to a new life. That was what her father, Gerald Whitmore, had called it, when he'd gathered the family in the sitting room of their Kansas farmhouse and unrolled the land survey map across the kitchen table. A new life. He'd said it the way preachers said salvation, like it was already done, like it was just a matter of showing up to receive it. There was land in Colorado Territory, he'd said. Good land. Rich soil, clean water, room enough for the whole family to build something real. Her brother Thomas had leaned forward over the map with both fists on the table, and her sister-in-law Vera had made approving noises, and her mother had folded her hands in her lap and looked at the floor, and Claire had stood in the doorway and felt the particular familiar feeling of a decision being made that she had no part in making. She was used to that feeling. She'd been living inside it for most of her life. She wasn't useful enough to be consulted and wasn't invisible enough to be left behind. That was the position she occupied in the Whitmore family, the middle ground that was somehow worse than either extreme. She wasn't as strong as Thomas, wasn't as capable as Vera, wasn't as quiet and enduring as her mother. Her hip had been wrong since the winter she was 16. Not broken, not crippled, just wrong enough to slow her down on bad days, just wrong enough for her father to look at her sometimes with an expression that wasn't quite contempt, but was close enough to its neighborhood that she knew the address. She came anyway. When Gerald said they were leaving in 3 weeks, Claire had packed her trunk and helped her mother put up the last of the preserves, and not once asked whether there was room for her in the plan. She'd assumed there was. That was her first mistake. The second mistake was falling. It happened on the 17th day of travel, on a section of mountain road that went narrow and switched back hard against a granite shelf. The wagon lurched the way wagons did on that kind of ground, and Claire, who had been riding up top beside her brother to save space in the wagon bed, had grabbed for the bench rail and missed. She'd hit the sideboards shoulder first, then hip first, and then she'd been in the wagon bed with her face against the canvas and her right side on fire, and her brother looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. She'd read it later, though. She'd had time to read it over the following days as her hips swelled and the bruise spread, and she started to slow them down, started to need help getting in and out of the wagon, started to wince at the jolting on bad road, started to become, in the language her father had never needed to say out loud, a burden. She read the expression on her brother's face that day. It was relief. Some part of Thomas Whitmore had been looking for a reason for a long time, and Claire had handed him one by falling off a wagon in the middle of the Rocky Mountains. She hadn't known it then. She knew it now. She walked for 40 minutes before she stopped to rest. Her hip was bad, worse than it had been that morning when she'd climbed down from the wagon at dawn to help her mother with breakfast. And Gerald had said very quietly that they needed to talk about pace, that they were behind schedule, that the mountain section was harder than the survey had shown, and the horses were tired, and he'd looked at Claire with that almost contempt expression that lived near contempt's address, and he hadn't finished the sentence. He hadn't needed to. Her mother had kept her eyes on the coffee pot. Thomas had said, "It might be easier if," and then stopped himself, and Vera had taken Thomas's arm and steered him a few steps away, and Claire had looked at her father and understood that the conversation had already been had. That this moment here at the cook fire at 5 in the morning wasn't a conversation at all. It was a notification. She'd eaten breakfast. She'd helped clean up. She'd climbed back into the wagon. And then, at a wide flat section of trail around mid-morning, Gerald had stopped the horses and said that Claire should stretch her leg, that she should walk a stretch of flat trail, that it would do the hip good to move on level ground instead of jolting in the wagon. He'd said it so reasonably. She'd climbed down without a word because she'd believed him. That was the thing she couldn't stop turning over in her mind. Now she'd believed him because he was her father, and that was what fathers were supposed to be, people you could believe. She'd walked ahead on the flat trail. She'd heard the wagon start up behind her. She'd thought they were following her at distance to let the horses rest at a walk. She'd walked maybe 100 yards before she looked back. The wagon had turned. It was heading back the way they'd come back toward the main switchback trail that would take them north away from the flat section away from her. She'd stood and stared at it for what felt like a very long time before she understood what she was looking at. Then she'd shouted her father's name. He hadn't stopped. She'd shouted Thomas. She'd shouted her mother's name. Margaret. She'd screamed it. Margaret, and her voice had cracked on the second syllable and gone high and strange. The wagon had kept moving. She'd started running, or trying to her right leg, going sideways with every other stride, and she'd covered maybe 30 feet before the pain made her stop. She'd stood in the flat mountain dirt and watched the wagon get smaller, and she'd screamed until she had nothing left to scream with. Her mother had not looked back once. That was the part Claire couldn't stop seeing. Not her father's deliberate forward gaze, not Thomas's turned shoulders. Her mother's hands folded in her lap, same as they'd always been folded when decisions were being made, and the back of her bonnet pale blue, not turning. Not once. She found a creek in the early afternoon and sat down beside it and drank from her cupped hands and tried to think practically. She had the clothes she was wearing, which included her everyday dress and a linen jacket that was good enough for July mountain weather, but would not hold up after dark. The small canvas bag she'd been carrying when she climbed down from the wagon, which held a folding knife, a handkerchief about half a strip of dried beef, and a small tin of matches. Her boots, which were good boots, Kansas-made with a double leather sole, and which she was grateful for, in the way you were only grateful for things once you understood what it would mean to be without them. She did not have food beyond the beef, a blanket, a coat, a map, a gun, or any realistic understanding of how far she was from any settlement in any direction. She sat beside the creek and ate the beef in small pieces, making herself go slowly, and she thought about what she knew about these mountains. She knew the trail they'd been following ran roughly north-south along this section of the range. She knew there were mining camps scattered through the high country, though she had no idea where the nearest one was. She knew it got cold at altitude after dark, even in summer cold in a way that could kill you if you weren't prepared for it. She was not prepared for it. She stood up and started walking again. She was still walking when the afternoon light started to angle west and the air coming down off the peaks began to have teeth in it. In July, in the Rockies, the temperature dropped fast after the sun moved behind the high ridges. Claire had felt it before traveling with the family, but she'd felt it from inside the wagon with a blanket across her lap and a cook fire to look forward to. She felt it now directly through the linen jacket, through the dress against her skin, and she understood in a new and very precise way what the night was going to be. She needed shelter. She needed fire. She needed both before full dark. The trail had been climbing for the last hour, working up through a long series of switchbacks into a section of old-growth timber. The trees were dense here, lodgepole pine mostly, with the occasional blue spruce, standing head and shoulders above the rest, and they cut the wind some, which was good, and turned the light gray-green and strange, which was less good. She couldn't see far in any direction. She couldn't tell if the trail was taking her toward something or away from it. She found a rock face that jutted out over the trail and created a shallow overhang, and she stopped there and looked at it and decided it was the best she was going to find before dark. She gathered what wood she could reach without going far from the overhang, piling it close. Her hip had moved past pain into something more like numbness, which she understood was not an improvement, but she was grateful for it anyway. She got a fire going on her third match. She fed it carefully, smallest pieces first the way her mother had taught her, and she sat close to it with her knees pulled up and her arms around them, and she watched the light fail around her. She thought about her mother's hands in her lap, the pale blue bonnet not turning. She thought about what it meant that her mother had known, because she had known. Claire was certain of it now, turning it over in the firelight. The conversation had been had before the wagon stopped. The decision had been made. Margaret Whitmore had known her daughter was going to be left on a mountain trail, and she had folded her hands in her lap and kept her eyes forward and let it happen. Claire pressed her forehead to her knees and held herself there for a long time. She did not cry. She wanted to, but the cold was coming in hard now, and she understood on some animal level that she couldn't afford to use herself up that way. Crying spent something you didn't have to spare out here. She could cry later somewhere warm and safe. She would work on getting warm and safe first. She fed the fire another piece of wood and looked up at the narrow strip of sky she could see between the tree line and the rock overhang. Stars coming out clear and cold. No clouds. That was something. No storm tonight at least. She leaned against the rock and closed her eyes and told herself she was going to be fine. She was not sure she believed it, but she kept telling herself anyway because the alternative was not something she could afford to look at directly just yet. Can be. She woke before dawn, to a fire gone to ash, and a cold so sharp it felt like something had a hand around her lungs. She sat up fast, gasping, and immediately regretted it when her hip sent a white bolt of pain up through her side. She pressed her hand against her hip and breathed through it and looked around. Gray pre-dawn light. Trees. The dead fire. The rock overhang. Still alive. Okay, she said again. Same word. Same no one to say it to. She got the fire going again, 2 matches this time, and sat close to it while the light built and the cold backed off a degree or two. She had no food left. The water she'd carried from the creek in her tin had a skim of ice across it, which she held close to the fire until it melted, and then she drank it and felt the cold of it all the way down. She thought about her options. Going back down the trail might take her to flatter ground, but it also took her away from any mining settlements which she believed were further north and higher up. Going forward on the trail was the better gamble, but it meant more climbing, and her hip was worse this morning than it had been yesterday, stiff from the cold, and the night on the ground swollen enough now that she could feel it pressing against the inside of her dress seam. She went forward. She walked for 2 hours, slow and grinding, stopping every 20 minutes to rest her leg. The trail climbed steadily, working through timber, and then out above the tree line into the open, where the full force of the July sun hit her, and she felt the temperature swing from cold to something closer to warm over the course of 20 minutes. The air tasted thin and clean. She could see for miles in every direction up here, ridges and valleys, and the white line of a creek threading through the green far below, and not a single sign of human settlement anywhere she looked. She stopped at the high point of the trail and put both hands on her knees and breathed. "Don't you quit," she said out loud. She didn't know if she was talking to herself or to her leg or to something else entirely. "Don't you dare quit on me now." Her hip said nothing back, but it held when she started walking again, and that was what mattered. She heard the horse before she saw it, or heard something, a sound that wasn't wind and wasn't tree and wasn't the creak of her own body moving. She stopped on the trail and listened. Hoofbeats. Single horse moving at a walk, coming from somewhere above her on the trail. She looked up. The trail bent around a rocky shoulder 50 yards ahead. She couldn't see past it. She thought about stepping off the trail. There were men in these mountains who were not the kind of men you wanted to meet alone on a high trail. She knew that in the abstract way, a woman knew a lot of dangerous things, aware of the fact, but not quite believing it would apply to her specifically, not until now. Now, she stood on the trail with her hand against her hip and thought very concretely about what it meant to be a woman alone, injured in the Rocky Mountains in 1871, with a stranger's horse coming around the bend. She stepped to the side of the trail. Not off it, she wasn't fast enough to get into the trees, but to the edge where she could see clearly and be seen clearly, where there was no ambiguity about what she was. The horse came around the shoulder of rock. And then, its rider. He was big. She registered that first, not just tall but broad through the shoulders, with the kind of solid build that came from actual work. And not just size, the kind of build that meant something in this country. He was wearing a canvas work shirt, the color of dust, dark wool trousers, and boots that had seen hard mileage. He had a hat pulled low against the summer glare, a working hat not decorative with sweat-stained rings on the crown. He was riding a dark roan horse that looked in better condition than most of the animals she'd seen on the trail west, and he was carrying a rifle across his lap in the casual way of a man who carried rifles, the way other men carried hats as a matter of routine, not statement. He saw her at the same moment she fully saw him, and the horse slowed without him appearing to signal it. He pulled up about 20 feet away and looked at her from under the hat brim. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked. She stood her ground and looked back. "You alone," he said. His voice was low and flat, the kind of voice that didn't carry any more than it needed to. It wasn't unfriendly exactly, but it wasn't particularly warm. It was a practical voice, the voice of a man asking a question because he wanted the information. "Yes," Claire said. He looked at the trail behind her, then at the trail ahead of her, then back at her. His eyes moved to her hip. She was standing with her weight shifted hard to the left, the way she did when the right side was bad, and apparently it was obvious enough to see from 20 feet. "How long?" he said. "How long what? How long alone?" She considered lying. There was a half second where she thought about saying she had a husband just behind her on the trail, a father, a brother. Someone, the kind of lie that was supposed to keep women safe in situations like this. But she looked at him, and something about the way he was sitting very still, very patient, his hands not moving, made her decide against it. "Since yesterday morning," she said. Something shifted behind his eyes. It wasn't pity. She couldn't have stood pity. It was something more like calculation, the same expression she'd seen on men making assessments of terrain or weather, the face of a man who was doing math. "Can you walk?" he said. "I've been walking." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He looked back perfectly still. "Not well," she said. He swung down off the horse in one clean motion, no wasted movement, and tied the reins to a boulder at the edge of the trail. He walked toward her, and she held herself very still, and he stopped 6 feet away and looked at her the way a doctor looks at a patient, not unkind, not kind, just assessing. "Caleb Mercer," he said. He didn't offer his hand. He just said the name the way you'd state a fact. Claire Whitmore, she said. He nodded once. Then he looked at her hip. Left side higher than the right, he said. How long's it been like that? 3 weeks. I fell from a wagon. Seen worse, seen better. He straightened up and looked at the trail ahead of her. Where are you trying to get to? Wherever there are people, she said. A settlement, a camp, somewhere. Nearest settlement's Holt Creek, he said. 12 miles north, mostly miners. It's not a comfortable place for a woman alone. Is there another option? He looked at her for a moment, then he looked back up the trail in the direction he'd come from. There's my cabin, he said. 6 miles. You won't make 12 in the condition you're in. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. She looked at him. He was not looking at her the way the men in Holt Creek might look at a woman alone, she was fairly sure of that. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at the trail, measuring, calculating, weighing options. There was nothing in it that frightened her, which was either a good sign or a very sophisticated trap, and she was in no position to find out which. Why would you do that? She said. Take a stranger in. He picked his hat up slightly and set it back. It was the only moment of anything that could be called discomfort she'd seen from him. I've got room, he said. And you've got a bad leg. That's enough of a reason. It wasn't enough of a reason. She knew that. A man didn't offer a strange woman a cabin in the mountains because he had room. There was something else in it, not anything threatening, she didn't think, but something she couldn't quite read. Some old obligation, or code, or decision made so long ago, it had become instinct. She looked at the trail. She looked at the 12 miles that stood between her and Holt Creek, which was not a comfortable place for a woman alone, and the night that was going to come again, and the hip that was going to get worse before it got better. All right, she said. 6 miles. He nodded. He walked back to the horse and untied the reins and came back leading it. You'll ride, he said. I can walk. You'll ride? He said again, and it wasn't a discussion. He crouched down without asking and laced his hands together, and she looked at him for a moment and then put her boot in his hands and let him boost her up onto the saddle. The horse stood steady as a stone. She got herself settled, her right hip screaming at the shift in position and then slowly, gradually easing as the pressure came off it. She looked down at Caleb Mercer, who had taken up the reins and had started walking, leading the horse up the trail at a pace that was clearly calibrated to her and not to him. He didn't look back at her. He just walked steady and unhurried, the rifle across his back now. Mr. Mercer, she said. Mercer, he said. Just Mercer. Mercer. She looked at the back of his hat. Thank you. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said without turning around, Save it. You don't know me yet. Claire looked at the mountain ahead of them. The sky was enormous and blue, and the summer air had a smell in it, like pine and cold water, and something she couldn't name, something that was just the mountains themselves, old and indifferent and enormous. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Her hip was on fire. Her family had left her on a mountain trail and not once looked back. She was riding a stranger's horse toward a stranger's cabin somewhere in the high country, and she had nothing with her but a folding knife and a tin of matches, and a name she'd given out to a man who'd told her she didn't know him yet. He was right. She didn't know him, but she was alive. She was moving. And for the first time since she'd stood in the mountain pass watching the dust fade, she was moving toward something instead of just away. She wrapped both hands around the saddle horn and steadied herself against the sway of the horse's walk, and looked at the trail ahead and kept going. She'd figure out the rest when she got there. The cabin was not what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. Something rough, maybe. Something that matched the man leading the horse up the trail, all hard edges and bare function. But when Caleb Mercer stopped in front of it and stepped aside so she could see it from the saddle, what she saw was a structure that had been built with more care than the word cabin usually carried. The logs were fitted tight. The roof was solid. There was a small porch with a bench on it and a hook beside the door for hanging gear, and the whole thing sat against the mountain in a way that looked intentional, like it had been placed there by someone who'd thought about wind direction and drainage and sunlight in winter. She noticed all of this from horseback, and said nothing about it, because she was also noticing that her hip had stiffened up badly during the 6-mile ride, and she was going to need help getting down, and that particular humiliation was taking up most of her attention. Mercer didn't make her ask. He came alongside the horse and held up one hand flat in a way that meant wait, and then he reached up and put both hands around her waist and lifted her down in one clean motion, setting her on her feet and immediately stepping back, giving her space before she'd even had to ask for it. She gripped the stirrup leather until her legs steadied under her. "Thank you," she said. He was already untying the saddlebags. "There's a chair just inside the door," he said. "Sit in it." She went inside. The interior was as spare as she'd have predicted. A table, 2 chairs, a cot against one wall, a wood stove with a cast-iron pan on top of it, shelves along the back wall, holding provisions in careful order. What she hadn't predicted was the books. There were 7 of them stacked on the shelf, beside the provisions' worn spines, well read. She didn't have time to read the titles before her leg gave a particularly sharp reminder that she'd been ignoring it for 6 miles, and she sat down hard in the chair by the door. Mercer came in behind her, set the saddlebags down, and crouched in front of the stove. He had a fire going in 4 minutes. She counted, because counting things was something her brain did when it was trying to manage more than it could hold, and right now, her brain was trying to manage hunger and pain, and the very strange fact of being in a stranger's cabin in the Rocky Mountains, with the smell of her mother's blue bonnet, still somewhere in the back of her mind, not turning. "You eaten today?" he said without looking up from the stove. "No. Yesterday. A little. Half a piece of dried beef in the morning." He stood up and went to the shelf. He moved through the space like a man who had lived in it long enough that every motion was already decided. No wasted steps, nothing tentative. He pulled down a tin and a cloth-wrapped bundle and set a pot on the stove and didn't look at her while he worked. She watched him and decided she was going to ask the question that had been sitting in her chest since he'd offered her the cabin on the trail. "Do you bring many people here?" she said. He didn't turn around. "No." "How many then?" He considered this for a moment, stirring something in the pot. "You're the first." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the afternoon wind was picking up, moving through the pines around the cabin in the low sound she was starting to associate with the mountains at this altitude. Not threatening, just present the way the mountains were present, constant and entirely indifferent to anything happening beneath them. "Why?" she said. He turned around then. He looked at her with those flat, assessing eyes, and she had the sense again of being measured not in any way that felt hostile, but in the way a carpenter measured wood precisely and without sentiment. "Because you were going to die up there," he said. "That's why." "People die in the mountains," she said. "You don't stop for all of them." "I stop for who I find," he said. "That's all it is." She wanted to push it further, but something in his expression closed the question off. Not rudely, just firmly the way you'd close a door. Not locked, just shut. She filed it away and let it go. The food he made was beans and dried salt pork, simple as anything she'd ever eaten, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in 3 weeks. She didn't say that out loud. She ate slowly and steadily, and he sat across the table from her and ate the same thing in the same silence. And it was the most comfortable silence she'd sat in since she'd left Kansas. That surprised her enough that she thought about it for a while after, while he cleared the tin plates, and she sat in the chair with her hands folded in her lap. Not her mother's way of folding hands. Not that. She spread them flat on the table instead, palms down. "I need to know something," she said. He stacked the plates on the shelf and looked at her. "What are your expectations?" she said. "For me being here." He pulled the other chair out from the table and sat down across from her. He looked at her steadily. "I don't have any." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." He set his forearms on the table. "You need somewhere to sleep and food to eat, and time for that leg to come right enough to travel. I've got all 3 to spare right now. That's the whole of it. And when my leg is right enough, Then you go to Holt Creek or wherever else you're heading. And what do I owe you for it? He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name, some expression that came and went too fast. Nothing, he said. I don't accept charity, Claire said. It's not charity, he said. It's... He paused, and this was the first time she'd seen him search for a word, the first small crack in the deliberateness of him. It's just the way things are out here, Miss Whitmore. You help who needs helping. Nobody owes anybody for it. She looked at him. She thought about her father's voice saying a new life over a map in a Kansas kitchen. She thought about the word burden said out loud or not. She thought about 37 feet of running and then stopping because her body couldn't go further and watching the wagon get smaller. I can work, she said. While I'm here, I can cook, I can mend, whatever needs doing inside while your leg is right. He looked at her for a long moment. My leg's fine. I know, she said. I said while my leg is right, while I'm healing. I can carry my own weight. I'd like to. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. All right. All right, she said. That was the agreement. No ceremony, no papers. Just two people across a plain table in a mountain cabin, deciding to exist in the same space and be useful to each other and not make more of it than that. She fell asleep in the chair before full dark and woke to find a wool blanket across her shoulders and Mercer's cot, empty, and she understood that he'd given it to her and was sleeping somewhere else, or not sleeping at all. And she sat for a moment in the quiet of the cabin with the fire banked low and the stars showing through the single window and felt for the first time in what felt like years completely and totally safe. She didn't know what to do with that feeling. She held it carefully, like something that might break. Then she lay down on the cot and slept the hardest 8 hours of her life. She was up before him the next morning. That surprised her. She'd expected a man who lived alone at this altitude to be an early riser, and he was. But she'd been awake since before first light, her body's new habit of early panic wearing off slowly as she remembered where she was and that she was, in fact, still alive. She'd been watching the window lighten by degrees and thinking about what she'd told him the night before. I can carry my own weight. She'd meant it. She needed to mean it. She needed it to be true, and the only way to make a thing true was to act as if it already was. She found flour and salt and lard on the shelf and made biscuits on the cast-iron pan by the time she heard him moving outside. Her hip was still wrong, but the rest had helped. She could stand at the stove without gripping the shelf, could move across the cabin with only a slight hitch in her stride, instead of the full-body lean she'd been doing yesterday. He came in the door and stopped. He looked at the pan on the stove. He looked at her. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, she said. Sit down. He sat down. She set a biscuit and a tin cup of coffee. Real coffee, she'd found it behind the flour and used it without asking, and decided she'd apologize later if he objected in front of him, and then sat across from him with her own. He picked the biscuit up and ate it in 2 bites, set the cup down. You're a good cook, he said. I know that too, she said. Something happened to his expression then. Not quite a smile, but related to one, some relaxation around the eyes, some easing of the particular careful stillness he carried. It was there and gone in a second, but she caught it. I'm going out to check the trap lines, he said. I'll be back by midday. Don't walk more than you need to. I was planning to restack your firewood, she said. It's going to fall. He looked at her. How do you know that? Because I can see the end of the porch from the window and the stack is leaning. He was quiet for a moment. I'll see to it when I get back. I'll see to it before then. It's not strenuous. Miss Whitmore. Claire, she said. If I'm staying here, we're not standing on ceremony, and the woodpile is going to fall whether you're here to watch it or not. He picked up the coffee cup. He looked at her over the rim of it. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone more... He stopped. Helpless, she said. He didn't deny it. He just set the cup down and stood up and picked up his rifle from the hooks by the door. He paused in the doorway. The woodpile, he said. "Stack the birch separate from the pine. Burns different." "I know how wood burns," she said. He almost smiled again. Then he walked out the door, and she heard the horse's hooves on the trail for a few minutes, and then nothing but the wind in the pines. She sat for a moment with her hands around the coffee cup. Then she got up and went to fix the wood pile. She had the wood restacked and 2 of his shirts re-hemmed. She'd found his sewing tin under the shelf, and the shirts in a pile that suggested he'd been meaning to get to them for some time before he came back at midday. He came back with 2 rabbits and a look on his face that she was starting to recognize as his neutral expression, the one that didn't mean anything in particular, but sat on top of whatever he was actually thinking. He looked at the wood pile. He looked at the shirts folded on the table. He didn't say anything about either. "I can dress those if you've got salt," she said, nodding at the rabbits. "I know how to dress my own game," he said. "I know you do," she said. "I'm offering to do it while you rest. You've been out since before dawn. Sit down." He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she couldn't read. Then he hung the rabbits on the porch hook and sat down in the chair she'd pointed at, and she went out to the porch and dressed the rabbits with his hunting knife. And her hands did the work without hesitation, because she'd been doing this since she was 9 years old, and no one had ever told her it wasn't a thing. Women did, only her sister-in-law Vera, who thought it was unrefined, and Vera was somewhere on a Colorado trail, probably drinking weak coffee and talking about what she was going to do with her new land, and Claire was here in the mountain sun, dressing rabbits for a quiet man who had given her his cot, and she decided she didn't mind this at all. She came back inside and put the meat in the pot with water and the last of the dried herbs she'd found and a handful of the rice from the shelf, and she didn't ask whether that was all right. She just did it. He watched her from the chair. "Where are you from?" he said. "Kansas," she said. "Outside of Abilene. We had a farm." "We?" "My family," she said. She kept her hands in the pot. "My father, my mother, my brother Thomas, and his wife. They're the ones that left you," he said. It wasn't a question. She turned around. He was watching her with those flat, direct eyes. No judgment in them, no pity, just the fact of the thing stated plainly the way he stated everything. "Yes," she said. "Why?" She turned back to the pot. "I slowed them down. My hip after I fell. They decided I was more of a problem than I was worth on the trail." The silence behind her had a texture to it. She could feel him sitting in it. "Your own family?" he said. "Yes." "And they just stopped the wagon and left." "They told me to walk a stretch of flat trail," she said. "Said it would be good for my leg. Then they turned north while I wasn't watching." She paused. "I ran after them, as much as I could run." She paused again. "My mother didn't look back." She heard the chair shift. She heard him stand up. She kept her eyes on the pot. She heard him walk to the window and stop there. He stood there for a long time without saying anything. "That's not something a person does," he said finally. His voice was different, something in it had moved some tightness under the flatness. "To their own." "Apparently they do," Claire said. Her own voice came out steadier than she expected. "Or some of them do anyway." "It's not right," he said. Simple, absolute. "No," she said. "It's not." He came away from this window and sat back down, and she stirred the pot, and neither of them said anything else about it. But something had shifted between them in those few minutes. Some weight had been laid down and acknowledged, which was different from being fixed, but was still something. Still more than nothing. She served the stew when it was ready, and he ate all of it, and she ate most of hers. And when she started to take the plates to the shelf, he said, "I'll do that." And she let him because it seemed important to him to do something. On the 3rd day, her hip was well enough that she walked to the creek and back without stopping. She counted it as a victory and didn't tell him because he would have told her not to push it, and she would have had to disagree, and she was trying to avoid unnecessary disagreements until she understood him better. She was starting to understand him better. He was not cold. She'd thought he was cold those first hours, that flat voice, Those measuring eyes, the way he said things without framing them or softening them. But cold wasn't right. He was just very literal. He said what he meant and meant what he said and didn't decorate either one, and once she stopped waiting for the decoration and just listened to the words, she found that there was warmth in them. Just compressed. The way heat compressed in a well-made stove, hotter for being contained. He brought her wildflowers on the 4th day. Not as a gesture, she was fairly certain he hadn't thought of it as a gesture. He came in from checking the traps with a fistful of something purple he'd pulled from the meadow above the cabin, and set them on the table next to where she was working, and when she looked up at him, he said, "Thought they'd help with the smell of the rabbit," and walked straight past her to the stove. She looked at the flowers for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He said. She put them in his water cup and set them in the window and caught him looking at them twice before supper. It was on the 5th day that the first real trouble came. She was sitting at the table with his mending. He had more of it than she'd initially found, a whole pile of things needing attention, when she heard hoofbeats on the trail below the cabin. Not one horse, several. She went to the window and looked out. 3 men coming up the trail. She didn't know them. They weren't dressed for mining, too clean, too deliberate, the kind of men who traveled with a purpose and knew what it was. Mercer came off the porch before she could say anything. He must have heard them from outside. He stood in front of the cabin door, not blocking it exactly, but positioned the way he was positioned, still deliberate, taking up space in a way that was entirely intentional, and waited for them to stop. The man in front did the talking. He had a dark hat and a voice designed to carry. "Mercer," he said, like they knew each other, like the knowing wasn't particularly comfortable. "Holland," Mercer said. Same flat voice, but something underneath it now, something like attention being paid at a different level. "Heard you had a visitor," Holland said. His eyes went to the window, and Claire stepped back from it without thinking. "Word travels fast up here," Mercer said. "Mining camps got ears," Holland said. "Woman traveling alone, they said. Injured." His eyes came back to Mercer. "Is she your wife?" "She's a guest," Mercer said. "That's a careful answer," Holland said. "It's the true one," Mercer said. "Is there something you need, Holland, or did you ride 6 miles to count heads?" Holland looked at him for a moment. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that happened at the front of the face, and stopped there. "Her family's looking for her," he said. "Put out word at Holt Creek. Said she wandered off the trail, got lost. Offered a reward for bringing her back." Everything inside Claire went very still. She heard it from the window, every word. She pressed her hand flat against the cabin wall and stood there with her heart going at twice its normal pace. Her family is looking for her. The lie was so complete, so neatly constructed, that for a second she almost didn't recognize it as a lie. Wandered off, like she was a dog that had slipped a fence, like she had gotten herself lost, like they had not stopped that wagon and turned it north and watched her run after them, screaming. "She didn't wander," Mercer said. His voice had not changed in pitch or speed, but she heard something in it now that she hadn't heard before, something cold and very, very controlled. "She was put off the trail, on purpose." Holland raised his eyebrows. "That's a serious claim against a family man." "It's what happened," Mercer said. "She'd tell you that she did. And you believe her." "Yes," Mercer said. "Just that. Yes." Holland looked at him for a long moment. The 2 men behind him hadn't moved or spoken. "The father's offering $40, Holland said. "That's real money." "For me or for her," Mercer said. "For whoever brings her in." "She's not lost," Mercer said. "She's exactly where she chose to be. Tell her family she's alive and well and choosing her own path from here." "They'll come up themselves," Holland said. "If you won't bring her." "That's their right," Mercer said. "And this is my property. They're welcome to stand at the end of my trail and shout." Holland looked at the window again. She pressed herself against the wall, but she kept her eyes on Mercer. "You're making trouble for yourself," Holland said. "Over a woman you don't even know." "Wouldn't be the first time I made trouble for a good reason," Mercer said. He didn't move an inch. "You know the trail back, Holland. It's the same one you came up." Holland looked at him for a long, still moment. Then he turned his horse around, and the other two turned with him, and they rode back down the trail without another word. Mercer stood in front of the door until they were out of sight. Then he turned around and came inside. Claire was standing in the middle of the room. Her hands were at her sides. She was trembling not from fear, or not only from fear. From something that was also fury, or was adjacent to it, the kind of shaking that came when a thing you'd been holding very carefully started to press against the inside of you harder than you could hold it. He looked at her. He saw the trembling. He didn't make it into something smaller than it was. "My family said I wandered off," she said. Her voice came out remarkably steady. "That's what they told people." "Yes," he said. "They put out a reward." "Yes." "To bring me back." She looked at him. "To where they left me." "I expect," he said carefully, "that it's not about you coming back. It's about controlling the story." She stared at him. Then she looked at the table at the shirt she'd been mending at the purple flowers in the water cup. "What do I do?" she said. It came out smaller than she meant it to. He walked to the shelf and poured 2 cups of water and set one on the table in front of her. Then he sat down in his chair. "First," he said, "you sit down. Then we think it through, one thing at a time." She sat down. She picked up the cup. She looked at him. "They're going to come up here," she said. "My father. He will come." "Maybe," Mercer said. "He'll make trouble for you." "He can try," Mercer said. And the way he said it wasn't bravado. It was just assessment. The same flat-grounded tone he brought to everything Rabbit's Trail conditions the woodpile, and now this. He can try, as if it was just another problem with a practical solution, and the solution would present itself if they sat still long enough to let it. She pressed both hands flat on the table, same as she'd done that first night. She looked at Caleb Mercer across it. He was not her family. He owed her nothing. He'd said so himself. Nobody owes anybody. He'd told Holland the truth when he could have taken $40 and handed her over, could have called it not his business, could have said he believed the family's version of events the same as anyone else might have. He hadn't done any of those things. He'd stood in front of his own cabin door and told 3 men that she was exactly where she chose to be. She was exactly where she chose to be. She hadn't chosen it that first day. She'd had no choice at all. But sitting here now in this spare, clean cabin, with the purple flowers in the window and the fire banked in the stove, she thought that maybe she was choosing it now. Maybe that was what surviving something meant, that you got to make the choice afterward even if you hadn't had one at the time. "I'm not going back," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're not. And if my father comes, we deal with it when he does," Mercer said. "Not before." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines, and the afternoon light was starting to shift toward gold, and from somewhere far up the ridge, a hawk was making its long, cold cutting call across the sky. She picked up the shirt she'd been mending and went back to work. She could feel him watching her, though he said nothing. And she did not mind being watched, she found. Not like this. Not by a man who watched the way he watched, not possessive, not calculating, not waiting for something from her. Just present. Just steady. Just there. She set her last stitch and smoothed the fabric flat with her palm, and she thought about $40 and a pale blue bonnet that had not turned, and she thought about a man who had said yes when asked if he believed her. Yes, just that. She was going to need it to be enough. She was going to make it enough. She folded the shirt and reached for the next one. Gerald Whitmore came on the 7th day. Claire heard the horses before Mercer did, or maybe he heard them first and said nothing, giving her the extra seconds to prepare herself. She would never know which. What she knew was that she was standing at the stove when the sound reached her, and her hands went still on the pot handle, and the whole cabin seemed to contract around her the way a chest contracted when you braced for a blow. She set the pot down. She turned around. Mercer was already at the window. He stood to the side of it, not square in front of it, looking out at an angle. His rifle was on the hooks by the door, where it always lived, but his eyes had gone to it and come back, which told her something about how he was reading the situation before she'd even seen it herself. "How many?" she said. "3 horses," he said. "Your father, I'd reckon, and 2 others." She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window edge. She looked out. Gerald Whitmore sat the lead horse like a man who had rehearsed this arrival. He was wearing his good coat, the dark wool one he saved for church, and for situations where he wanted to project authority, and his hat was straight on his head, and his back was very square. Behind him were 2 men she recognized: Ned Purvis, who owned the feed store in their Kansas town and had made the trip west with them, and a 3rd man she didn't know, broad-shouldered and wearing a town marshal's badge that caught the mountain light. A badge. He'd brought a lawman. Her stomach dropped 6 inches. "He brought a marshal," she said. "I see it," Mercer said. His voice was perfectly level. "That changes things." "It complicates them," he said. "It doesn't change them." She looked at him. He was watching the 3 riders with the same expression he brought to everything, measuring calm, working the problem. She wanted to grab his arm and tell him that a man with a badge was not a trapline problem, was not a woodpile problem, was not the kind of thing you could solve with practical thinking and steady hands. But she looked at his face and understood that he already knew that, and that steady hands were still what he had to offer, and maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. "Stay inside," he said. "No," she said. He looked at her. "He came for me," she said. "I'm not going to stand in here and let you fight my battle through a door." He held her gaze for a moment. "Then stand behind me," he said, "and let me start it." She nodded. He lifted the rifle off the hooks, not in a threatening way, just in the way of a man who lived in mountain country and didn't go outside unarmed, and opened the door and walked out onto the porch. She came out behind him and stood to his right, 1 step back, and looked at her father. Gerald Whitmore's eyes went to her immediately. They moved over her, the dress, the slight hitch in how she was standing, the cabin behind her, and something worked in his jaw. "Claire," he said. She said nothing. "I am relieved to see you well," he said. His voice had the measured quality she'd grown up with, the one that sounded like reason and felt like a hand on your shoulder pressing down. "We've been worried sick." "Have you?" she said. It came out flat. She hadn't planned for it to come out flat, but there it was. His eyes moved to Mercer. "I'd like to speak with my daughter," he said. "You're speaking with her now," Mercer said. "She can hear you fine." Gerald looked at the rifle, then back at Mercer's face. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "Neither am I," Mercer said. The marshal moved his horse a step forward. He was a heavy man, somewhere in his 50s, with a carefully neutral face that had probably been useful in his work for a long time. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I'm Marshal Briggs, riding out of Holt Creek. I'm not here to cause difficulties. The family's concerned about the young lady, and they've asked me to accompany them, that's all." "Appreciated," Mercer said. "She's well. She's safe. She's here by her own choosing. She's my daughter," Gerald said. The measured quality cracked slightly just at the edges. "She's 22 years old, and she was injured, and she wandered." "She didn't wander," Mercer said. Gerald stopped. "She was put off the trail," Mercer said. "On foot, with a bad hip and half a day's food. I found her 2 days later and brought her here because she would have died otherwise." He paused. "You know that. Which is why the story you're telling is wandered and not left." The silence that came down over the group then was the particular silence of a thing being said that everyone present knew to be true, and no one had expected to hear, said out loud. Gerald Whitmore's face went through several expressions very quickly, none of them settling into anything clean. Marshal Briggs looked at Claire. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "is what this man says accurate?" This was the moment. She felt it the way you felt a current in a river, not from seeing it, but from the pull of it against your legs. Everything that came after was going to come from what she said right now in the next breath. She looked at her father. He was looking back at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, not the almost contempt, not the measuring look, not the church code authority. Something raw, something almost like fear. Good, she thought, and hated herself slightly for thinking it, and thought it again anyway. Yes, she said. It's accurate. Gerald opened his mouth. He stopped the wagon on a flat section of trail, she said, and her voice came out steady and clear, and she was going to be grateful for that for a long time afterward. He told me to walk a stretch for my leg. Then he turned the horses north and didn't come back. I ran after them. I couldn't keep up. She paused. My mother didn't look back. Marshal Briggs was very quiet. That's not, Gerald started. I was there, Papa, Claire said. Don't. The word Papa came out of her differently than she'd expected, not warm, not bitter, exactly, just accurate. The word for what he was nothing more than that, a biological fact. Gerald looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Mercer. Whatever calculation he'd brought up the trail with him, whatever story he'd rehearsed, whatever argument he'd prepared, she could see him revising it in real time and not finding a better version. She needs to come home, he said finally. Back to the family. I don't have a home, Claire said. You left it in Kansas. We have land in Colorado. I know about the land, she said. I know exactly what the land is worth to you. I know what I was worth to you when I stopped being able to work it. Her voice didn't shake. I'm not going, Papa. Gerald's jaw tightened. He looked at Briggs. Marshal, she's injured. She may not be thinking clearly. She sounds perfectly clear to me, Briggs said. He said it mildly, but it landed like a stone. He looked at Claire again. Miss Whitmore, you're an adult woman. Are you here by your own choice and free will? Yes, she said. Are you being held here against your will or under any kind of coercion? No, she said. Are you in need of medical attention or assistance that this man is not providing? She almost said no again automatically and then stopped. Her hip was still wrong. She'd been managing it, had been careful, but the truth was, it needed more than rest and care. I need a doctor to look at my hip at some point, she said, but that's a matter I can arrange myself. Briggs nodded slowly. He looked at Gerald Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, he said, I'm afraid I can't compel a grown woman to go anywhere she doesn't wish to go. That's not within my authority, and it wouldn't be right if it was. Gerald's face went dark. She's my daughter. Yes, sir, and she's also a grown woman who's telling me plainly what she wants. Briggs gathered his reins. I'd suggest you head on back to Holt Creek. There's nothing more to be done here today. Gerald did not move. He sat his horse and looked at Claire with an expression she couldn't fully read. Anger, yes. And something underneath it that might have been shame, or might have been the closest thing to shame a man like Gerald Whitmore was capable of. You don't know what you're doing, he said to her. I know exactly what I'm doing, she said. I learned that from you. You always knew what you were doing, too. That hit. She saw it hit. He pulled his horse around without another word, and Ned Purvis turned with him, and Marshal Briggs paused for a moment and looked at Mercer. You're taking on something considerable, he said, not as a warning, just as a statement of fact. I'm aware, Mercer said. Briggs looked at Claire. If you need anything, Miss Whitmore Holt Creek is 12 miles north. Ask for me. Thank you, Marshal, she said. He tipped his hat. Then he turned his horse and followed Gerald Whitmore back down the trail, and the three of them disappeared around the curve of the mountain, and the sound of the hooves faded, and the mountain came back into itself. Wind Pines, the far-off hawk. Mercer didn't move from the porch for a full minute after they were gone. She stood beside him and didn't move either, both of them listening to make sure the sound kept going away and not coming back. Then he turned and went inside and put the rifle back on its hooks, and she followed him and sat down in her chair because her legs had decided they were done being steady. You all right? He said. No, she said, but I will be. He sat down across from her. He didn't say anything, and she was grateful for it. Grateful in the particular way you were grateful for someone who understood that some moments didn't need filling. After a while, she said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For not letting me stand behind that door." He looked at her for a moment. "You wouldn't have stayed behind it anyway," he said. "No," she said, "but you didn't try to make me." He picked up the coffee cup he'd left on the table before all of this had happened and found it cold and set it back down. Outside, the afternoon was going on exactly as it had before, indifferent to everything that had just been decided under it. "He'll try again," Mercer said. Different angle. "I know," she said. "He doesn't give up on things he wants." "What does he want? It's not you specifically. He made that clear enough." She looked at the table. "He wants the story," she said slowly, working it out as she said it. "He wants to be the man who brought his daughter home from the wilderness. He wants the $40 back, and the she stopped. He wants there not to be a version of events where he left me on a mountain to die. Because if that version exists, and people believe it, it's the version that's true." Mercer looked at her for a long moment. "It is the version that's true," he said. "I know," she said. "But knowing and being believed are different things." He was quiet. Then, "Briggs believed you." "Briggs is one man. One man with a badge is worth 20 without," he said. "And he heard it from your own mouth on your own property without anyone putting words in yours." He paused. "That matters." She looked at him. He said it the way he said everything, plain, grounded, no decoration. But it was the most she'd heard him say at once, and she understood that it was his version of comfort, this laying out of practical truths, this building of a case for why things were going to be manageable. She found she believed him. She wasn't sure yet if that was wisdom or just need, but she let herself have it either way. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She got up and went back to the stove and put the pot back on the heat, and they didn't talk about her father again that evening. And supper was quieter than usual. And when she went to sleep on the cot, she lay awake for a while listening to the mountains settle around her and thinking about the expression on Gerald Whitmore's face when she'd said, "I know exactly what I'm doing." She thought about it until she believed it herself. Then she slept. 3 days later, she found out why Caleb Mercer lived alone. It wasn't something he told her directly. It was something she pieced together from the things she found and the things he almost said, and the particular way he went silent sometimes in the evenings, sitting by the stove with a book he wasn't reading, his eyes somewhere past the page. She found the photograph on the 9th day, when she was reorganizing the shelf to make room for the additional provisions he'd brought back from a supply run to the lower trail. It had been tucked behind the flour tin face in against the wood, and it fell out when she shifted the tin and landed face up on the shelf. A woman. Young, maybe 25, dark hair. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was halfway between serious and amused, the look of someone who had been told to hold still and was finding it difficult. Claire picked it up carefully. She looked at it for a moment. Then she heard Mercer's boots on the porch, and she set it back on the shelf face up this time and moved away. He came in the door and saw it immediately. She knew he saw it because he went very still for just a fraction of a second, a stillness she'd learned to read by now, and then he kept moving to the hook for his hat. "I'm sorry," she said. "It fell out when I moved the flour." "It's all right," he said. She waited. She had learned that waiting was sometimes the only way with him, that he would get to things in his own time, and not before, and pressing only made the time longer. He sat down and picked up the photograph. He looked at it for a long moment with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, not measuring, not calculating. Just open, raw in the way that things were raw when the covering wore off them. "Her name was Anna," he said. "My wife." Claire sat down across from him. She didn't say anything. 4 years ago, he said. Fever. It came fast and went fast, and she was gone in a week. He set the photograph down on the table face up between them. "I came up here after. Couldn't be in the settlement. Too many people knowing and looking and meaning well." He said the last two words in a way that made it clear meaning well had been its own particular kind of unbearable. "I understand that," Claire said quietly. He looked at her. "Do you? People who mean well look at you like you're a wound," she said. "Like they can see through you to the thing that's wrong. It's—" She stopped. "It gets heavy." He nodded slowly. "That's exactly what it is." He looked at the photograph again. "I didn't plan to stay up here this long. 4 years is—" He stopped. "It becomes the shape of things," Claire said. He looked at her sharply. She looked back. "You're 22, he said. "I know how long I've been alive," she said. "That doesn't make me wrong about this." He looked at her for a moment. Then the almost smile came and went. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She looked at the photograph. "She was beautiful," she said. "Yes." "She looks like she was funny." He blinked. Something moved across his face. "She was," he said. "How'd you see that?" "The way she's looking at the camera," Claire said. "Like she thinks the whole business of taking a photograph is slightly ridiculous, but she's going along with it to be kind." He looked at the photograph again, and for a moment, something came all the way to the surface of his face. Grief and warmth, and something that was adjacent to joy, the complicated expression of someone who had loved something and lost it, and was still 4 years later, both things at once. "That's exactly right," he said. His voice was very quiet. "That's exactly her." She didn't say anything else about it. She got up and put supper on, and he put the photograph back on the shelf. Face out this time, she noticed, not face in, and they ate together in the easy silence that had become the texture of their evenings, and she thought about a woman named Anna, who had been funny and was gone, and about a man who had come to the mountains to be somewhere. The looking didn't reach him, and about the particular way loneliness shaped people over time, the way water shaped stones slowly, completely, until you couldn't remember what the original surface had been. She thought about what her own surface had been before Kansas, before the wagon, before the mountain trail. She wasn't sure she could remember it either. On the 11th day, the second twist came. And this one, she hadn't seen at all. It came in the form of a letter delivered by a rider from Holt Creek, who left it on the porch without knocking, apparently under instruction to do so. Mercer brought it in and looked at the envelope and handed it to her across the table. Her name was on it. Written in handwriting she recognized. Her mother's handwriting. She held the envelope for a long time without opening it. Mercer poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down and didn't say anything. Finally, she opened it. The letter was 2 pages. Her mother's handwriting was very neat, the way it always was. She'd had good schooling. Margaret Whitmore before the farm, and the Kansas years had narrowed everything down. Claire read it once very fast, and then started again from the beginning slower. She read the whole thing twice before she set it down. Mercer was watching her face. "Good or bad?" he said. "I'm not sure," she said. She picked it up again and read him the relevant parts aloud. Her mother had not approved of leaving Claire on the trail. Had argued against it, the letter said more than once in the days before it happened. Had threatened to go back herself after. Had not been able to. "Your father is not a man who can be moved once he's decided," the letter said, "and I was not strong enough. I am telling you this not to excuse myself. There is no excuse for it, but because I need you to know that not turning around was the hardest thing I have ever done, and I have done many hard things." Claire stopped reading aloud there. She sat with that sentence for a moment. The hardest thing I have ever done. She didn't know what to do with it. She'd been so certain, so completely cleanly certain, that her mother had been complicit, had been part of it, had chosen Gerald over her daughter, and kept her eyes forward, and not suffered for it. That certainty had been one of the things holding her upright these past 11 days. The clear, clean line of it. The righteous anger that gave her something to stand on. And now here was her mother's handwriting saying the hardest thing I have ever done, and the clean line blurred. Mercer was quiet. "What do you make of it?" she said finally. "What do you make of it?" he said back. "I don't know," she said. "I want to be angry at her. I am angry at her. But—" She stopped. "She wrote. He doesn't know she wrote, I'd guess." "Probably not," he said. "She's telling me she was a coward," Claire said. "That's what the letter is. She's telling me she knew it was wrong and did it anyway, and she wants not forgiveness. She's not asking for that." She looked at the letter again. "She's asking me to know the truth. That it wasn't that she wasn't—" She stopped again. "That she didn't look away easy," Mercer said. Claire looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That." She folded the letter and held it in both hands and looked at the table. Mercer drank his coffee and let her think. "What does she want you to do?" he said after a while. "She wants me to be careful," Claire said. "She says my father isn't finished, that he's talking to people in Holt Creek, men he knows from the trail men with business connections. She says he's found a lawyer." She paused. "She says he's claiming I'm incompetent to make my own decisions. Because of the hip and the fall, and she thinks he's going to try to have me declared. She doesn't use the word directly, but she means legally incompetent, unable to manage my own affairs." The silence in the cabin changed quality. Mercer set his cup down very slowly and carefully. "He can't do that," he said. "Not without a doctor and a judge and—" "He found a doctor in Denver who hasn't seen me," Claire said. "That's what she's saying. A man who'll sign a paper for money." She looked at him. "My father is very good at finding men who'll do things for money." Mercer stood up. He walked to the window and stood there looking out with his hands loose at his sides, which she'd learned was his version of working hard on something internally. "If they get a paper like that," he said without turning around, "it changes what Briggs can and can't do, even if Briggs knows it's wrong." "Yes," she said. "We need to get ahead of it," he said. "How?" He turned around. His face had gone back to the measuring expression, the assessment face, but there was something else behind it now, something that looked like anger, quiet, and contained the compressed kind. "You need to talk to a real lawyer," he said, "before your father gets his paper signed. You need someone who can stand up in front of a judge and testify that you are exactly what you are, a healthy adult woman in full possession of herself, who was wrongfully abandoned and is making her own choices." "I don't know any lawyers," she said. "I know one," he said. "In Denver, man named Aldous Kraft. He's good. He's honest, which is rarer." He paused. "He was Anna's cousin." She looked at him. "You'd reach out to him for me." He looked back at her steadily. "You're not going to sit up here on this mountain while your father buys a piece of paper that says you're not yourself," he said. "That's not something I'll allow to happen." The word "allow" should have rankled. Coming from him in that voice, it didn't. It was simply the statement of a man who'd made a decision and wasn't going to unmake it the same way the woodpile decision had been made, the same way the cabin door decision had been made. She looked at him and felt something shift in her chest. Not romantic, not yet or not only. Something more fundamental. The feeling of being defended not because she was weak, but because the defense was right, and a man who understood the difference between those two things was a man worth knowing. "All right," she said. "Write to him." He went to the shelf and pulled out paper and an ink bottle and sat back down at the table and started writing. She watched him write. His handwriting was not what she'd expected, careful and clear, each letter deliberate. She thought about Anna, who had been funny and was gone. She thought about a man who'd spent 4 years letting the loneliness shape him up here where the looking didn't reach. She thought about what it meant that he was writing this letter. He finished it and set the pen down and folded the letter and looked up at her. "I'll get it to the Holt Creek Post in the morning," he said. "Mercer," she said. He looked at her. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "And I don't want nobody owes anybody. I want the real answer." He looked at her for a long moment. He picked up the pen again and set it down again. "Because what they did to you is wrong," he said. "And because I've spent 4 years not doing anything that mattered, and you need someone to do something that matters." He paused. And because... He stopped. Because what? She said. He looked at the photograph on the shelf. He looked back at her. Because you're not nothing, he said. You never were. And someone should have told you that a long time ago. And since they didn't, I'm telling you now. The fire was the only sound in the cabin for a long moment. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines and a late summer storm was building somewhere past the eastern ridges. She could smell it coming. The electric sharpness in the thin mountain air, the pressure changing. She looked at Caleb Mercer across the table. She thought about the woodpile and the purple flowers in the water cup and the rifle held steady in front of 3 men and the letter he was going to carry down the mountain tomorrow morning before she was awake. She thought about you're not nothing. Thank you, she said. And this time she meant something different than she'd meant any of the other times she'd said it, something larger and less specific, the kind of gratitude that didn't have clean edges. He picked up the folded letter and stood up. Storm coming, he said. I'm going to see to the horse. I know, she said. I can smell it. He paused in the doorway, just for a second. He looked back at her over his shoulder with an expression she hadn't seen before and didn't have a name for yet. Then he walked out into the thickening evening air, and the door swung gently behind him, and Claire Whitmore sat alone at the table with her mother's letter in one hand and the changed shape of everything in front of her, and listened to the storm coming in over the mountain, and held herself very still inside it. The storm hit just after midnight, and it hit hard. Claire woke to the sound of the wind doing something she hadn't heard it do before, not moving through the pines in that low, familiar way, but driving against the cabin walls with a force that made the whole structure shudder, a sound like something large and furious, throwing itself against the logs from every direction at once. She sat up on the cot and heard the stove door rattle and heard something on the roof shift, and then she heard Mercer already moving boots on the floor, the scrape of the chair, the particular sequence of sounds that meant he'd been awake before she was maybe all night. Stay put, he said from across the dark cabin. What is it? Wind got ahead of the rain, he said. I need to check the roof brace on the east side. There's a section I've been meaning to fix. She heard him pull on his coat. She heard the door open, and the wind came in hard and cold and alive. And then the door shut behind him, and the cabin went to a muffled roar. She sat in the dark and counted. She got to 40 before she decided she wasn't going to sit in the dark counting, and she got up and found her boots by feel, and pulled them on, and crossed to the stove and got it stoked back up. By the time the cabin had some light from the fire, she'd found the lantern and lit it, and when Mercer came back in 8 minutes later, soaked the wind, having brought the rain in hard right behind him, he stopped at the sight of the lamp burning and looked at her standing at the stove with the coffee pot in her hand. I told you to stay put, he said. You were gone 8 minutes in a storm, she said. Sit down. He looked like he was going to argue. Then he pulled off his wet coat and hung it and sat down, and she poured the coffee and set it in front of him and sat across from him with her hands wrapped around her own cup, and they listened together to the storm work itself out against the cabin walls. Is the brace fixed? She said. Good enough for tonight, he said. I'll do it proper in the morning. She nodded. He drank the coffee. Outside, the storm pushed and pushed against the logs. You didn't sleep, she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at his cup. I sleep light. You didn't sleep? She said again. You were sitting up when I woke. I could tell by the way you moved. No. She stopped herself. I'm sorry. That's not my business. It's all right, he said. He turned the cup in his hands. I don't sleep well when weather's coming. Learn to read it up here. The pressure changes, the horse gets restless. By the time the storm hits, I've usually been awake a few hours. Every storm, she said. Most of them. She thought about that. 4 years of light sleeping, of reading the pressure changes and lying awake while the mountains did what mountains did around him. 4 years of that particular kind of alone. That sounds exhausting, she said. He looked up at her with a surprised expression, as if the observation had come from an angle he hadn't been expecting. I don't think about it, he said. I know, she said. That's what makes it exhausting. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the cup. "You're not easy to talk to," he said. "I've been told that," she said. "I don't mean it as a complaint." She looked at him across the table, in the warm circle of the lamp, with the storm pressing its hands against the cabin around them, and thought about how strange it was to be here. Not frightening. Strange, not wrong. Strange, but the kind of strange that was so precisely right, that it felt like something you'd been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. She thought about Aldous Craft in Denver, and the letter Mercer had taken to Holt Creek 2 days ago, and the reply they were expecting any day now. She thought about her father's good coat and Marshall Briggs's carefully neutral face, and a lawyer in Denver who had been Anna's cousin. She thought about how quickly your whole life could be remade when the old one was taken away. The storm went on until nearly dawn. They sat with it, taking turns adding wood to the stove, talking sometimes and not talking other times. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, Mercer told her about the first winter he'd spent in the cabin, when the snow had come so deep he couldn't open the door for 2 days, and he'd read all 7 of his books twice through and started writing in the margins of the last one, just to have something to say to another mind. "What did you write?" she said. "Arguments," he said, "with the author. He was wrong about 3 things." "Was he?" "Still is," Mercer said. "The book didn't change." She laughed. It came out before she could decide to do it. Just came out sudden and real, and she felt it all the way through her chest, the way you felt the first warm day after a long cold spell. Mercer looked at her with that almost smile, and this time it got a fraction further than usual, and she thought that might be the closest she was going to get to seeing him laugh, and found she was all right with it. Around 4 in the morning she fell asleep at the table with her head on her arms, and she didn't wake until full daylight. She was in the cot. He'd moved her there without waking her, and covered her with the blanket, and by the time she sat up, he was outside already. She could hear him working on the roof brace, the steady sound of a hammer on wood, deliberate and even. She lay still for a moment and looked at the photograph on the shelf. Anna, who had been funny, and was gone. She looked at it, and didn't feel the guilt she'd half expected to feel lying in this man's cot, having slept 8 solid hours after almost laughing together in a storm. She felt something quieter than guilt. Something more like gratitude directed at a woman she'd never met for having loved this man well enough that even 4 years later you could see the shape of it in him. She got up and made breakfast. The reply from Aldous Craft arrived on the 14th day, carried up by the same Holt Creek rider who'd brought her mother's letter. Mercer was on the trap line. She took the envelope from the rider and waited until he rode away before she opened it. It was 2 pages, the handwriting precise and professional. She read it twice, standing on the porch, and by the time she'd finished the second reading, her hands were not entirely steady. Aldous Craft had already heard of the situation. That was the first thing. Word had reached Denver through the mining camp network. Gerald Whitmore had been moving fast, talking to people, building the case for incompetency with the energy of a man who needed it to be real before someone proved it wasn't. Craft had made inquiries. The doctor Gerald had found was a man named Pelham, who had lost his medical license in Ohio 3 years prior, and was now operating in Colorado territory on a certificate of questionable origin. More importantly, Craft had spoken to Marshall Briggs, who had been more forthcoming in a written statement than he perhaps would have been in person, and what Briggs had said matched everything Claire had told Mercer on the mountain trail. The second page was practical. Craft was willing to come to Holt Creek himself. He didn't want Claire traveling to Denver in her current condition, and he was concerned that if she left the mountain, Gerald might find a way to intercept her before she reached a judge. He would arrive in approximately 10 days, he said, and he would bring with him a territorial magistrate he trusted, and they would put the incompetency claim in front of the magistrate and bury it where it couldn't be dug up again. And then there was the last paragraph. She read it 3 times before she was sure she'd understood it. Craft wrote that he'd looked into the land claim her father had filed in Colorado territory. He'd found something. The land her father had brought his family west to claim had a prior filing, a legitimate one registered with the Territorial Land Office 18 months prior under the name of a mining consortium out of Denver. Gerald Whitmore's claim was invalid. He'd either not known which was possible, or he'd known and was hoping to establish presence before the conflict surfaced, which, given everything else about Gerald Whitmore, was the more likely explanation. The land was gone. The whole reason for the journey, the map on the Kansas kitchen table, the new life said like salvation. All of it was built on a claim that wasn't real. Claire sat down on the porch bench and held the letter in her lap and looked at the mountain. She felt things in a strange order. First, something that was almost like satisfaction. The clean, ugly satisfaction of a thing you suspected being confirmed. Then something more complicated, a kind of grief that surprised her, because she hadn't expected to grieve for a future she'd stopped believing in. Then anger, a slow-building anger that wasn't the sharp, reactive kind, but something deeper, the kind that came from understanding something fully for the first time. Her father had brought his family across 5 states on a false claim. He might not have known. It didn't matter whether he'd known. He'd made the decision and carried everyone with him, and when the carrying got difficult, he'd lightened the load, and he'd done it so easily, so practically, so reasonably, in that measured voice, with the church coat and the straight back. She was sitting on the porch, reading about the wreckage of her family, when Mercer came back from the trap line. He took one look at her face and tied the horse to the post without asking anything. He sat down on the other end of the bench and waited. She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched his face while he read, the eyes moving steadily, the jaw going tight at the second page, the stillness coming over him that she'd learned meant he was managing something carefully. He set the letter down. "The land claim," he said. "Yes." He didn't know, Mercer said. Not defending, just stating what he thought was true. "Maybe not," she said. "Does it change anything?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. "No," he said. "He made choices he can't put back. Knowing or not knowing doesn't undo them." "Kraft is coming in 10 days, she said. "With a magistrate." "I read it." "It'll be finished then, the incompetency claim." "Yes." She looked at the mountain. "And then what?" He was quiet. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the mountain too, his face in profile, and he had the expression he wore when he was working something out that he didn't have language for yet. "That's up to you," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm asking what you think." He turned and looked at her directly. He held her gaze the way he always did. No flinching, no looking away, the full weight of his attention on her, which she'd learned to receive without looking away herself. "I think you're not the same woman you were 2 weeks ago," he said. "I know I'm not. And I think—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I think whatever you decide, you'll make it right. Whatever direction you go." "That's not what I asked," she said. He looked up at her. "I asked what you think," she said. "About what comes next. For here. For this." She gestured between them, a small motion, and it was the most direct she'd been, and she felt the risk of it like a physical thing in her chest, but she didn't pull it back. He looked at the space between them that she'd gestured at. He looked at his hands again. He looked back at her. "I think I haven't thought past one day at a time in 4 years, he said. "And I'm not sure I know how to do it anymore. Think past one day." "Try," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere up the ridge the hawk called that long carrying sound. "I'd like you to stay," he said. Simply, plainly. The same way he said everything. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because the cabin is better with you in it," he said. "Because supper is better. Because I sleep better when there's someone else breathing in the room." He paused. "Because I was half a man before the trail, and I've been less than that since Anna, and I don't know what I am when you're here, but it's more than I was." She held that. She held it the way she'd held the feeling of being safe that first night, carefully, like something that might break if she pressed too hard. "I'm not Anna," she said. "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you to be. And I haven't had—" She stopped. Started again. "I'm 22 years old, and I've spent my whole life being told I was less than useful, and I don't know how to—" She stopped again. Neither do I, he said, know how to do much of this. She looked at him. He looked back. Two people on a porch bench with a mountain behind them, and the ruins of the old version of things spread out in their laps, and something neither of them had names for yet sitting in the space between. All right, she said. I'll stay. Through Kraft's visit at least. Through the legal business. And after, he said. Ask me after, she said. He nodded. He stood up and took the rabbits off his belt and went inside to clean them, and she sat on the bench for another few minutes, looking at the mountain and feeling the particular texture of a decision made the way it settled into you heavier and steadier than a thing undecided. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket and went inside. The days between then and Kraft's arrival were different from the days before, and both of them knew it without saying it. Nothing dramatic changed. They ate together and worked their separate tasks, and talked in the evenings and were quiet in the evenings. But something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, and it sat in the cabin with them like a third presence, not uncomfortable, just real in the way that true things were real, taking up the space they deserved. On the 16th day, she walked the full perimeter of the cabin and back without stopping, and her hip was at about 3/4 of what it had been before the fall. She didn't tell him until she'd done it twice. Your hip, he said, looking at how she was moving. Better, she said. How much? Enough, she said. He looked at her steadily. Claire. It's not all the way right yet, she said. But it's better. I can do more. He started to say something cautious, and she held up one hand. Don't, she said. Don't tell me to be careful with myself. I've been careful for 2 weeks. I'm allowed to get better. He closed his mouth. He picked up his coffee cup. He set it down. All right, he said. She had started doing more. She went with him to check the shorter sections of the trap line, walking the cleared trail behind him, and he set his pace to hers without commenting on it, which she appreciated more than any accommodation she could have asked for directly. She watched him work the traps, the efficiency of it, the economy of motion, never more done than needed, never less, and she asked questions because she genuinely wanted to know, and he answered them the same way without making her feel the asking. On the 18th day, she reset a trap herself while he watched. She did it wrong the first time, and he showed her the correction once without commentary, and she did it right the second time. Good, he said, just that. But she took it and kept it. On the 19th day, Gerald Whitmore came back. She'd known he would. She'd told Mercer he would that first afternoon after the confrontation on the porch. But knowing a thing was coming and feeling it arrive were different, and when she heard the hoofbeats on the trail, she felt the old contraction in her chest, the old instinct to make herself smaller, and she pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed through it. This time, he came alone. No Purvis, no Marshall, just Gerald Whitmore on his horse, and he stopped at the edge of the cabin yard and didn't come further. Mercer was inside. He heard the horse and came to the door and looked at Claire. I've got it, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. He didn't go far. She heard him settle into the chair just inside, but he gave her the porch. She walked out and stood at the top of the steps and looked at her father. He looked older. She hadn't expected that it had been less than 3 weeks, but he looked older in a way that had nothing to do with time. His coat was not the good one. He wasn't sitting the horse the way he had before the practiced authority of it. He was sitting it the way a tired man sat a horse at the end of a long day, and the day had been longer than usual. I know about the land claim, she said, before he could speak, before he could set the frame of it. Kraft found the prior filing. You didn't have a claim. Gerald's face moved. She'd expected denial, or the measured voice, or the authority. What she got was something that looked almost like relief, the expression of a man who'd been carrying a particular weight and had just been told he didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't know, he said. When we left Kansas, I didn't know. When did you find out? She said. He was quiet. Papa, she said. When? Outside of Denver, he said. We stopped for supplies, and a man at the trading post knew the land, knew the consortium. He told me. He stopped. He looked at the horse's mane. I thought if we got there fast enough, established presence, maybe... He stopped again. I was wrong. Yes, she said. You were. He looked up at her. And something she'd never seen before was on his face. Not the almost contempt, not the measured authority, not even the fear from before. Something much older and much worse. Something that looked like a man seeing the full extent of what he'd done for the first time. I left you on that trail, he said, like he was hearing the words for the first time by saying them. I left my own daughter. Yes, she said. You did. I thought you'd walk back down to the main road. I thought someone would. You knew the condition my hip was in, she said. You knew I couldn't walk 12 miles. You knew. He said nothing. His jaw worked. Say it, she said. Claire, say what you did, she said. Out loud. Not to me, to yourself. You've never said it out loud, have you? You've been telling everyone I wandered off. You've been building a whole paper case to say I'm not in my right mind. But you've never actually said the true thing. The mountain was very quiet around them. I left you, Gerald Whitmore said. His voice came out rough and stripped down. Nothing measured about it. I left you on the trail, and I didn't go back, and I told myself it was... He stopped. There's no way to finish that sentence. No, she said. There isn't. She stood on the porch step and looked at him. This man who had been the shape of home for 22 years, who had taught her to count and to read, and who had looked at her bad hip with something too close to contempt for too many years, and who had turned a wagon north on a Colorado mountain trail and not stopped, and she felt things she didn't have clean names for. She expected the anger to be the biggest thing. It wasn't. The biggest thing was something that might have been grief, or might have been the exhaustion of carrying a door that had never quite closed. I'm not coming with you, she said. That's finished. I know, he said quietly. And the incompetency claim needs to stop, she said. Kraft is coming in 2 days. You'll have a chance to do this without it going in front of a magistrate. I'd suggest you take it. He looked at her for a long moment. And your mother, he said. She wrote to you. She did, Claire said. She wants... He stopped. She would like to know you're safe. She knows I'm safe, Claire said. Kraft will write to her. I'll have him include a note. She paused. But that's between me and her. That's not your business anymore. He sat very still on the horse. He was not a small man. He'd always been physically imposing part of the authority of him. But he looked small now somehow. Not in body. In the other way. In the way that mattered. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him. She waited to feel something large happen when he said it, some door swinging open, some weight lifting. It didn't. The word sat in the mountain air and was exactly what it was true and too small and real. I know, she said. And she did. She could see that he was. It didn't change what he'd done. It didn't make her want to go anywhere with him. But she could hold both things, his sorrow and her refusal, without one, canceling the other. And that felt like something she'd grown into in the last 3 weeks, that particular capacity. You should go, she said. Go to Kraft when he arrives. Make it right the legal way. Take care of Mama. Gerald looked at the cabin door where Mercer was sitting just inside, quietly present. Is he good to you? He said. Yes, she said, without hesitation. Gerald nodded once. He pulled the horse around. He rode down the trail, and this time she watched him go all the way until the trail curved and took him out of sight, and she felt something settle in her. Not peace exactly, but the beginning of it. The ground floor of it. She turned around and went inside. Mercer was in the chair, his hands around a coffee cup, his face carefully neutral. He looked at her. Well, he said. He admitted it, she said. Out loud. Something moved in Mercer's face. Good, he said. He's going to stop the claim, she said. I think he will when Kraft arrives. And she sat down. She looked at the table, at the 2 cups sitting on it, at the familiar ordered space of the cabin that had become, without her noticing the exact moment it happened, something she thought of as hers too. And nothing, she said. It's done. He looked at her steadily. Are you all right? She considered this honestly. I will be, she said. I meant it this time. He nodded. He pushed the 2nd coffee cup across the table toward her. She picked it up and held it with both hands and let the warmth of it come into her palms. And outside the mountain, afternoon was doing what it always did, going on large and indifferent and beautiful. And inside the cabin, Caleb Mercer sat across from her and didn't try to make any of it smaller or larger than it was. And she thought that this right here, this exact ordinary moment, was maybe the best thing she'd ever been given. She didn't say that. She just drank the coffee, but she thought she might say it someday. And that was enough for now. Aldous Kraft arrived on a Tuesday 2 days after Gerald Whitmore rode down the mountain for the last time. He came with the magistrate, a lean, gray-haired man named Horace Venn, who had the careful eyes of someone who'd spent 30 years listening to people lie to him and had gotten very good at knowing when they weren't. Kraft himself was younger than Claire had expected, maybe 40, with an honest face, and Anna's same dark coloring, and when he shook Mercer's hand on the porch, he held it a beat longer than necessary, and looked at him with an expression that said more than either of them put into words. Caleb, he said. Aldous, Mercer said. That was all. But Claire watched it happen and understood that something had been acknowledged between them, some long gap, some old grief, some complicated love that survived absence, the way certain things survived hard winters, not unchanged, but still alive. They sat at the table, all 4 of them, and Kraft laid his papers out with the efficiency of a man who'd done this many times in many difficult places and had learned to move through the difficulty without adding to it. He went through the incompetency filing first. He'd already spoken to Gerald, he said. Gerald had signed a withdrawal of the claim the previous evening in Holt Creek, witnessed by Marshal Briggs and 2 others. Claire sat very still. He signed it, she said. Voluntarily, Kraft said. And completely. He looked at her steadily. He also signed a separate statement attesting that you were left on the trail deliberately and that the account of you wandering was false. That statement is now part of the territorial record. The room was quiet. He didn't have to do that, she said. No, Kraft said. He didn't. She looked at the table. She thought about her father on the horse looking small in the way that mattered. She thought about, I left you said out loud, stripped of everything that usually dressed his words. All right, she said. What else? What else was the land claim? Kraft walked them through it with the same careful efficiency, the prior filing the Denver Consortium, the invalidity of Gerald's claim. He'd already been in contact with the consortium, he said. They were aware of Gerald's presence on the trail and had no interest in pursuing action against a family who'd arrived in good faith on bad information. They wanted only the formal acknowledgement that their claim was prior, which was already in the territorial record. So my father has nothing, Claire said. He has whatever he can build on land he can legitimately claim elsewhere, Kraft said. There's available land further north. Harder country, less developed. But land. She nodded slowly. She thought about Thomas and Vera, about her mother folding her hands in her lap, about a map on a Kansas table and a voice saying a new life like it was already done. And me, she said. Legally, where do I stand? Kraft looked at her. You are a competent adult woman in full possession of yourself and your faculties, he said. That is now a matter of territorial record, witnessed by a sitting magistrate. He gestured to Venn, who nodded once precisely. You are under no legal obligation to your father or to anyone else. You are free to live where you choose, work where you choose, and make whatever arrangements you see fit. She held that, the full weight of it. Free to live where she chose. She'd never had that said to her before. Not as a legal fact, not as something witnessed and recorded. It should have felt larger, maybe some enormous lifting. Instead, it felt quiet, like a room after a long argument finally ends. The silence is the point. The silence is what you were working toward all along. Magistrate Venn leaned forward. He had a document in front of him, and he turned it to face her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I'll need your signature here, attesting that you understand your legal standing and that you've entered into no arrangements under duress." She picked up the pen. She signed her name in the space he indicated, Claire A. Whitmore, the same signature she'd made on letters home from the Kansas schoolhouse at 9 years old, and it felt entirely different, now felt like something claimed, rather than just written. She set the pen down. Venn gathered the papers and stood, and Kraft stood with him, and the two of them moved to the door with the practiced efficiency of men who understood that some conversations needed to happen without them in the room. "We'll give you a few minutes," Kraft said. He looked at Mercer once more, and the look said something that Claire wasn't quite meant to read, and then the door closed behind them, and it was just the two of them at the table. Mercer was looking at the window. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "It's done," she said. "Yes." She looked at the papers in front of her, her copy of the documents, the territorial record, the signature. She looked at the photograph on the shelf. She looked at Caleb Mercer, who was still looking at the window, with the expression she'd learned to read as him working something up to saying. She waited. "You're free to go," he said. "That's what the paper says." "I know what it says," she said. "Kraft has contacts in Denver," he said. "Respectable households. Women who've come west alone have found work there. Good work. Teaching housekeeping seamstress positions. You'd be comfortable." She looked at him. He was still not quite looking at her. She noticed his hands on the table, flat, very still, the way they went when he was being careful. "Is that what you want?" she said. "Me to go to Denver?" "It's not about what I want," he said. "I'm asking what you want," she said. Directly, same as I asked before. He turned from the window and looked at her. His face was very open in this moment, more open than she'd seen it. The careful stillness stripped back something underneath it that was simply a man in a room with a woman he didn't want to leave. "I want you to stay," he said. "I said that. I meant it then, and I mean it now." "Then say so," she said. "Not as an option among other options. Say it like you mean it." He stood up from the table. He walked around it until he was standing close to her, closer than he usually stood, and she looked up at him and held completely still. "Stay," he said, low, flat, plain. "Not because you have nowhere else to go. Because this is where you belong. Because I've watched you for 3 weeks, and I know what you're worth, and it's more than anyone's ever told you, and I'd like to spend a long time reminding you of it." He paused. "That's what I want." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's the most you've said at once since I've known you," she said. "I've been building up to it," he said. She stood up. They were very close now, and she looked at him directly, at this man who had lifted her off a mountain trail and given her his cot and stood in front of his own door with a rifle and said yes when asked if he believed her, and written a letter to a lawyer for a woman he'd known 4 days. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." He exhaled one short breath, barely audible, and she understood it was everything he had in the way of relief. "All right," he said. She looked at the door. "You should probably tell Kraft before he rides to Denver with contact information for teaching positions." Something that had never quite made it to a smile before got all the way there. Not large. Mercer didn't do large, but real, and it changed his whole face, and she took a moment to simply look at it before it went back to something quieter. He opened the door and called Kraft back in, and what he said was simple. "She's staying." And Kraft looked at him and looked at her, and something in his face came and went quickly. Relief, maybe, or the particular happiness of someone who'd been hoping for something without letting themselves believe in it. "Good," Kraft said, simply. And then, the weeks that followed were not simple. Simple was not the texture of the life they were building, but it was real, and real was better than simple by a long measure. Kraft handled the remaining legal business from Holt Creek, making the 2-day ride twice more to sort the final details. The territorial record was clean. The incompetency claim was buried and signed over and witnessed by a man whose signature meant something in Colorado territory. Gerald Whitmore filed a new land claim 80 miles north on harder ground, and Thomas and Vera went with him, and that chapter closed. The way chapters closed, not with resolution exactly, but with a door that was finally fully shut. Her mother wrote again 3 weeks later. A shorter letter this time, only 1 page, and it said less and meant more. Margaret Whitmore was not coming north with Gerald. She was staying in Holt Creek, she said, with a family who'd offered her a room in exchange for help with the household, and she was well, and she would like to know that Claire was well too. Claire wrote back. It was a short letter. She told her mother she was well. She told her she was staying on the mountain. She didn't say more than that, but she signed it. Your daughter Claire, and she meant the your in the plainest possible way. Not as property, not as obligation, but as simple biological fact that could exist alongside everything else. The way most true things existed alongside each other in real life, complicated and unresolved and present. She left the letter with Mercer to take to Holt Creek on his next supply run, and she didn't think about it again for a while because there were other things to think about. There was the roof brace which Mercer had fixed properly after the storm, but which needed additional support on the west side, and she held the timber while he worked and handed him things, and learned the names of the tools by asking until he started handing them to her before she asked, because she knew which one came next. There was the trap line, which she walked the full circuit of, now 3 weeks after Kraft's visit. Her hip at something close to 90%. Not perfect, the Dr. Kraft had brought out from Holt Creek. Said it might never be 100%. But 90 was enough. 90 was more than enough. 90 let her do everything she needed to do, and some things she'd never expected to do. There was the morning Mercer came in from an early check of the upper line and found her writing at the table and didn't say anything, but came to look over her shoulder, and she'd been writing to nobody in particular. Just writing the way you wrote when something needed to come out, and you didn't have another way to move it through you. And he read a few lines without meaning to and straightened up. You write well, he said. I used to, she said. I'd forgotten. He went to the stove. She kept writing. After that, he sometimes asked her to read to him in the evenings from one of the 7 books, and she did. And sometimes she stopped at a passage and said what she thought about it, and sometimes he disagreed and said so plainly. And those were some of the best conversations she'd ever had. 2 people in a fire-lit cabin at altitude, arguing sincerely about whether a dead man's ideas were right or wrong. Both of them taking it seriously because they both took everything seriously, because that was the kind of people they were. It was during one of those evenings that she understood she was happy. Not in a sudden way, not like a door opening. In the gradual way that things that are real arrived slowly, unremarkably, completely. She was sitting across from Caleb Mercer with a book in her lap and a fire in the stove, and she was happy. And she held it the same careful way she'd held the feeling of safety on that first night. And this time, she didn't worry it would break. The crisis came on a Thursday, 6 weeks after Kraft's visit, without any warning at all. She heard it before she saw it, a different sound from the trap line. Not the hoofbeats of a returning horse, but the horse alone coming back without its rider, which was wrong in a way that activated every nerve in her body at once. She was off the porch before she'd decided to move. The roan came into the yard at a trot reins, trailing saddle empty. She caught the reins with both hands and held the horse and looked at the mountain above the cabin at the trail that disappeared into the timber. And every rational thought she had said something happened, something bad. And every rational instinct said, go now. She tied the horse to the post. She took Mercer's second rifle from the hook inside. She knew how to use it. He'd shown her the basics 3 weeks ago, and what she didn't know she'd figure out, and she went up the trail at the fastest pace her hip would allow. She found him 40 minutes up the trail. He was on the ground at the edge of the path, and he was conscious, which was the first thing she checked, scanning him as she came close, the way he'd scanned her on the mountain trail that first day, looking for the worst thing first, so you knew what you were dealing with. He was conscious. He was holding his left arm against his body. His face was the color of old ash. "I'm here," she said. She was on her knees beside him before she'd finished the sentence. "What happened?" "Trap spring," he said. His voice was tight with the effort of keeping it steady. "The big one on the upper line. Cable snapped. The spring mechanism—" He stopped, breathed. "My arm." She looked at the arm. He was holding it just below the elbow, and the angle of it was wrong in a way that told her the bone was involved. She'd seen a broken arm once before Thomas when they were children falling from the barn loft. This looked worse. "Can you move your fingers?" she said. He tried. 3 fingers moved. The 4th and 5th didn't. "All right," she said. She was already pulling her jacket off. "I'm going to stabilize it. This is going to hurt." "I know that," he said. "Tell me if I need to stop." "You won't need to stop," he said. She worked fast and as carefully as she could, strapping his arm against his body with the jacket and her belt, making it as immobile as she could manage. He made no sound while she did it. His jaw was locked and his eyes were fixed on a point above her head, and she could see the effort it was costing him, not just the pain, but the surrender of it, the having to be still and let someone else do the work, which for this man was its own particular difficulty. "Done," she said. He exhaled. "Can you stand?" she said. "Yes." "Don't lie to me," she said. He looked at her. "Probably," he said, "with help." She got him up. It took 3 attempts and most of her strength, and she had to brace him with her whole body twice when his legs tried to go out from under him, and by the time he was vertical and moving, her hip was screaming, and she didn't pay it any attention because it was not the problem right now. They made it down the trail in 40 minutes, which was 20 minutes longer than she'd come up in. She got him inside and onto the cot and went for the medical kit she'd found it 2 weeks ago. Reorganizing the shelf had looked through. It had been grateful now that she had, and she cleaned the skin above the brake sight and strapped it more properly with the flat boards in the kit that were clearly there for exactly this purpose. And when she was done, he lay on the cot looking at the ceiling with his color still wrong, but his breathing steadier. "I need to get you a doctor," she said. "Holt Creek, 12 miles. "I know where Holt Creek is," he said. "Can you ride?" He thought about it honestly. "Not today," he said. "Tomorrow. If you—" He stopped. "If I what?" she said. He looked at her. "If you'll come with me," he said. "I don't want to make that ride alone." She looked at him. This man who had spent 4 years alone at altitude, who had ridden every trail in this mountain range by himself, who had not asked anyone for anything in longer than she could calculate. "Yes," she said. "Of course." She sat beside the cot and watched his breathing even out, and his color come back by increments, and she thought about a trail 2 months ago, and a woman on her knees in the mountain dirt, and about the way certain things turned. Not neatly, not in ways you could have predicted, but turned nonetheless, the way the mountains themselves had turned over long ages into what they were now. He was watching her. She realized he'd been watching her for a while. "You're not scared," he said. "I was scared on the trail," she said, "when I found the horse without you. But not now. Not now," she said. "Now I know what I'm dealing with." He was quiet for a moment. "You ran up that trail," he said. "With your hip." "Don't," she said. "I'm not criticizing." "I know," she said. "I just don't want to talk about my hip right now. I want to talk about yours, about getting you to Holt Creek tomorrow." He almost smiled. It got all the way there again, same as in the cabin after Kraft left, real and changing his whole face, and she looked at it and thought she would like to see that happen every day for a very long time. "You're not the same woman I found," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with those direct eyes, and there was something in them now that had not been there on the mountain trail. Something warm and particular, and entirely focused on her, not on a survival equation, not on a problem to solve. "Neither are you," she said. He reached out his right hand, his good arm, and she looked at it for a moment, and then took it, and his hand was large and rough and warm, and it closed around hers with a steadiness that felt like everything he was. All of it compressed into one simple gesture. They stayed like that for a while. No ceremony, no large words, just his hand in hers and the fire in the stove, and the mountain doing what it always did outside, going on enormous and patient and entirely their own.
Narag.
The ride to Holt Creek the next morning was slow and careful, and she rode beside him the entire way, close enough to catch him if his balance went, and he didn't need catching, but the closeness meant something to both of them, and neither of them mentioned it. The doctor in Holt Creek was a solid woman named Eleanor Marsh, who had come west from Philadelphia 12 years prior, and had long since stopped being surprised by the variety of injuries mountain life produced. She looked at Mercer's arm and said, "Clean break could have been much worse," and looked at Claire's splint work and said, "Who did this?" And when Claire said she had, Dr. Marsh looked at her with a different kind of attention. "Where did you learn this?" she said. "From looking at the kit and thinking it through," Claire said. Dr. Marsh looked at her for another moment. "Are you busy?" she said. Claire blinked. "I beg your pardon. I've been needing a second pair of hands for 2 years," Dr. Marsh said. "Someone who can think under pressure and doesn't panic at the sight of injury. I can teach the rest." She looked at Claire steadily. "Are you busy or aren't you?" Claire looked at Mercer, who was sitting on the examining table with his arm in a proper splint, now looking at her with that open expression she'd come to know, not directing, not deciding for her. Just watching. Waiting. The way he always waited. She looked at Dr. Marsh. She thought about the folding knife and the tin of matches and the woman who had walked 40 minutes on a failing hip because she needed to know what she was dealing with. She thought about what she'd written at the table that morning that she'd forgotten she knew how to write. She thought about being needed not as a convenience, not as a function, but as a specific, irreplaceable person in a specific place. "I live 12 miles up the mountain," she said. "I know where Mercer's cabin is," Dr. Marsh said dryly. "I've been the closest doctor for 4 years. 3 days a week you ride down. The other days, you're back on the mountain. I'll pay you in training and a fair wage." Claire looked at Mercer again. "Don't look at me," he said. "It's your answer." She turned back to Dr. Marsh. 3 days a week," she said, "and I need to be back on the mountain before dark." "Agreed," Dr. Marsh said. Claire nodded. "Then yes," she said. "I'm not busy." Marshal Briggs found them at the doctor's office an hour later. He came in with his hat in his hands, which she'd learned meant he was there personally, not professionally. He told them that Gerald Whitmore had come to see him the morning after riding down from the cabin for the last time. Had come in and sat down and told Briggs the full truth, all of it, the wagon, the trail, the lie about wandering the bought doctor in Denver, the incompetency claim. Had told it without being asked. Briggs had taken a statement. "Why are you telling me this?" Claire said. "Because you deserve to know that it was said," Briggs said. "Officially, on the record." He paused. "Your father is not a good man, Miss Whitmore, but he's not entirely without account for himself in the end. I thought you should know that too." She sat with that for a moment. She thought about what Mercer had said weeks ago. It doesn't change what he did. True. Completely true. And also something. Not enough. But something. "Thank you, Marshal," she said. He put his hat back on and nodded to Mercer and walked out. And the three of them, Claire, Mercer, and the quiet understanding of what had been said, sat for a moment in the examining room before Dr. Marsh came back in and reminded them both that her office was not a sitting room. They rode home in the late afternoon, taking it slow for his arm, and when the cabin came into view above them, on the mountain, Claire felt it the same way she'd felt it that first night on the cot, the feeling of safe but different now. Not the fragile kind, not the kind you held carefully in case it broke. The solid kind. The kind that had been tested and had held. She took the horses to the small shelter at the side of the cabin while Mercer went inside. When she came in, he was standing at the stove with his good arm, managing poorly with one hand, and she came and stood beside him and took the pot without comment, and he stepped back without comment, and they worked in the easy, wordless way they'd developed over weeks, the particular fluency of two people who'd learned each other's rhythms. She put supper on, and he sat at the table, and the fire was going, and the mountain evening came down blue and clean outside the window, and Anna's photograph was on the shelf where it belonged. She thought about what Dr. Marsh had said. She thought about 3 days a week, and riding down the mountain, and learning the names of bones, and what broke them, and how to put them right. She thought about Caleb Mercer sitting on an examining table, with a broken arm, watching her say yes to something, not directing, not deciding, just watching. She thought about, "You're not nothing." She plated the food and brought it to the table and sat across from him. And he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for weeks now, the way that had stopped feeling like assessment and started feeling like something else entirely. Something that didn't have a name yet, but was building toward one. "You start Monday," he said. "I know," she said. 3 days a week is a long ride." "I know that too." "You'll need a better horse," he said. "The roan's too slow for the lower trail in bad weather. I'll ask Kraft about the bay gelding he was trying to sell last month." She looked at him. He was looking at his plate, already practical, already planning for the next thing, and the thing after that, the way he planned for weather and trap lines and wood piles, forward-looking steady. Taking her future into the same account as his own, without making an announcement of it. She felt something come all the way to the surface. Something she'd been managing carefully for weeks, keeping below a certain waterline. It came up now, and she let it. "Mercer," she said. He looked up. "I love you," she said. Plain. Flat. In his own register, his own language, because it was hers now too. He held her gaze. Something moved all the way across his face, every layer of it, from the measuring surface down to whatever lived underneath that warm, careful, compressed thing she'd been catching glimpses of for 2 months. "I know," he said. She started to laugh and stopped herself. "That's all you've got." "No," he said. He put his fork down. He looked at her steadily, the full weight of his attention, nothing held back. "I love you too. I have since about the 4th day when you fixed my woodpile without asking, and brought me coffee without asking, and argued with me about my own shirts." He paused. "I just didn't know how to say it, without it sounding like more than you could carry." She looked at him. "It's not more than I can carry," she said. "I know that now," he said. She picked up her fork. He picked up his. They ate supper in the firelit cabin on the side of the rocky mountain, and the stars came out clean above the ridge. And the mountain went on being what it was, vast and old, and entirely indifferent. And inside the cabin, 2 people sat across a plain table, and were exactly enough for each other, which was the whole of it, which was everything. She'd been left on a mountain trail in July by people who'd decided she wasn't worth the trouble, and she'd walked until she couldn't. And she'd been found by a man who looked at her and saw the math and made a decision, and the decision had been the right one. Not because it had been easy, or because it had been without cost, or because the world had rearranged itself into something fair. The world had not done that. The world was still the same hard, tilted, indifferent place it had always been. But she was not the same woman, and he was not the same man. And what they had built in this cabin on this mountain out of necessity and honesty, and 2 people who refused to make themselves smaller than they were, that was real, and it was theirs, and nothing that had come before. It could take a single piece of it away. Claire Whitmore had been abandoned in the wilderness and had chosen with her whole self and both hands open to stay. And she was never for the rest of her long life on that mountain anything less than exactly where she belonged.